All right, well, we've been doing some adaptive planning here. We're quite a bit ahead of schedule, and we don't want to get too far off of that. What we decided to do is to start the public question session a bit early. We'll go for about 15 minutes here and break for lunch and then come back and have additional questions. So just to reiterate, we've got a lot of people watching on TV and on the web, so everybody be careful about speaking in the mic, not too close, not too far away. And then for those of you in the audience that have questions, we've got a microphone set up. You can make a line, come on up. And before you ask your question, if you could just say your name, and if you're affiliated with some organization, say that as well. And then you can ask your question of the panelists or of Chris. And we will take questions. We've got a website set up for that, and I'll occasionally read some of those for the panelists to respond to. So we're ready to get started. If anybody would like to come up to the mic and ask questions of either Chris or of the panelists and their impressions of Chris's studies. Yeah, go ahead, Falk.
Yeah, hello, my name is Falk Hoodman. I'm one of the reviewers. I have a question to Chris, and that relates a lot to the wildlife habitat study that's coming later. I think you didn't really present well on the accuracy of your mapping exercise. Usually when people do classification studies, they refer to certain accuracies, how well these work. My understanding is that you did mostly a qualitative assessment with categories, but you didn't tell us how well it really performs on the ground. Mm-hmm. This is important later if we do change detection. So over time, what has changed to go back. Could you talk a little bit about the accuracy of that product that you have developed there? Thank you.
Sure. So what Falk is referring to is so often in vegetation studies, especially vegetation studies that are include GIS models to extrapolate across a larger landscape. There's a component called an accuracy assessment. Mapping is produced, and then after the fact, scientists go out and they collect field data and they compare how well their on-the-ground observations match up with what was mapped through their process. We did not include a specific accuracy assessment as a discrete component of our methods. However, I think we did include a substantial amount of refinement that is, in a sense, a surrogate of an accuracy assessment. Earlier I talked about this continual evolution process where we collected field data, we produced mapping, we identified challenging sites that were difficult to map, and then we went back out into the field and we confirmed those, and then we came back and we updated the mapping. So with that, I have a high degree of confidence that the mapping does accurately reflect the conditions on the ground.
I'm Phil North, and I'm happy to say that I'm here unaffiliated. And so I wasn't surprised to hear the praise for the studies, because I know that your team was a stellar team with all the people who have been working on these wetlands and vegetation in Alaska and soils for a very long time. And I know most of those people, and they're all very, very good, so hence the results. So I wanted to just ask about maybe a next step, and whether you're going to take that information, in particular the functional information, and relate that to landscape functions, and in particular fish, and where the fish are, and what they're doing, and how the functions that you've identified are relating to supporting fish in the landscape. And wildlife, for that matter, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Phil. Charlotte, I don't know if you would like to address that as far as the next steps question.
Great. I'm not exactly sure what Phil's getting at. We've met with the Corps of Engineers and EPA and Fish and Wildlife Service to start discussions on functional assessment methodology. So we fully intend to do full functional assessment on all the wetlands. As we get further input from the federal agencies of which methods, there's multiple methods you can use. All of them have different strengths and weaknesses. So we've reviewed a lot of the functional assessment methods. We've made a proposal, the one we think fits best, and are just open to getting direction from the federal agencies to go further with that.
I think you could go a step farther than that. Doesn't. Yeah, okay. The research reserve, the Ketchikan Bay Research Reserve, has been publishing some information lately about how the wetlands relate to fish on streams on the southern Kenai Peninsula, and so anyway, they've specifically gone that next step of not just talking about, in theory, how do these wetlands function, but actually how does it relate to the fish in those streams. In particular, I think what's all of it is very good work, but in particular they looked at winter habitat, and it's kind of turned the management of winter habitat on its head, where we used to, was a general assumption and concession that deep water was winter habitat, that's where the fish would go in the winter, and they've shown that really it's the groundwater that's so important, and where you have groundwater coming into the streams, that's typically important winter habitat, and that just relates directly to the wetlands and how they're functioning. So.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it's certainly something the fisheries scientists have been working on and looking at, is where groundwater is coming in the winter time, and expanding our studies into winter habitat a bit more. So we will be integrating that, but I think we're just still trying to get to a functional assessment method and then find a way to put all that together along with the fish studies on groundwater upwelling and the winter studies.
I guess I would suggest then that there's an opportunity and maybe even a responsibility to really do what will be original research in elucidating those relationships a little bit more completely and in a different location than the southern Kenai Peninsula.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Randy Hagenstein with the Nature Conservancy, and I was only able to see the second half of your great presentation, so my apologies if you covered this. It sounds like there was some discussion of rare plants as included in the Alaska Natural Heritage Database. I'm wondering if you did any sort of targeted searching of, kind of small unique spots out there in the study area to look at finding occurrences of those species. So oftentimes these are happening in places with high mineralization or seeps or particular very small features on the landscape that you might miss if you're doing a standard vegetation or wetland description. But you can often find, if you go looking for very targeted micro habitats. Just wondering if you were able to do any of that kind of floristic survey as part of your investigations. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so inherent with the not only the density of samples, but one thing I didn't mention in my presentation was just throughout the course of a field day, the amount of ground that the ecologists would cover, and they would be. They weren't set up to necessarily walk a predefined transect with predefined points. They had flexibility in their day to meander, to pick up unique habitat or groundwater discharge sites, and they often did. And the teams very often included expert botanists, people like Mike, like Mike Duffy and others who have experience identifying rare plants throughout the state. And so while there wasn't a standalone targeted effort to try to find unique habitat types, I think that those areas were were well documented through the course of the field work. I mean, I can personally say that I often visited, very small sites, like discharge sites, the size of this table, specifically to see what was there and to see if there were. It's always a joy, and there's bragging rights with finding rare plants.
Well, I guess seeing no other questions. Oh, nope. All right.
Snuck in there on you. Okay, so I actually haven't. I just found out I was.
Well, can you identify yourself first?
I'm Michelle Sturdy. I work for BB&C, and I just found out I was coming to this morning, so I haven't had a chance to really look over some of my notes in reference to the EBD, which I looked at some time ago. But anyway, there are some sensitive plant species that are on the Alaska Natural Heritage Program tracking list that were within the plant species list, kind of in the appendices of the EBD, that were not called out in the text. It says that you guys were tracking for those species, but those species are listed by scientific name. However, there's no discussion within the text of them. I believe one was Cochlearia sessilifolia. And then my other question that I was curious about, and if you want specifics about what those plants are, you can ask me about them, and I can look in my notes. And then weed species. I think there was also mention in the text, if I remember right, again, it's been a while since I've looked at the EBD, but there's there's some vague note that we're looking for weed species if we kind of see them incidentally. But again, there were some weed species, according to the AC EPIC list, which is another kind of an interagency effort to document weed species and is also maintained by the Alaska Natural Heritage Program. So there were weed species within that list that, or within the, EBD plant list in the appendices. There were species that are also on the AC EPIC list. And I just thought those were never called out or mentioned in the text as well. And just generally speaking about invasives, development brings invasives. And yeah, there just doesn't seem to be much discussion about that generally. Because invasives do have the potential to alter an ecosystem. And so I personally feel it deserves some discussion. That's all.
So starting with rare plants, I'm very familiar with Cochlearia sessilifolia that you mentioned. I collected one of the specimens for it in near Williamsport. That species and the other tracked species, they match up with the list of tracked plants that University of Alaska had developed up through 2008, which was the published year of the EBD. And so that the species list is often updated by the university, on an annual basis, more or less. So there has not been a process to go back and kind of back and forth to look at new updates to the list and go back to the EBD. But the information is all there in the database if that needs to occur in the future at any point. As far as invasive species, baseline conditions, there really just aren't a lot of weeds. Most of the communities are not disturbed, and so weeds, when they were identified, were often they were trace. They had very low cover values, and we had an invasive species expert with us, Irina Lapina. She's a former employee from the University of Alaska. She worked with Robert Lipkin. So she's very familiar with what could be out there. I appreciate your question about development. I think that's probably beyond the scope of the environmental baseline conditions, and that I think that's maybe a discussion for something else.
I did find there was one of the very concerning species. I wish I had it in front of me. Sorry, Right. One of the species I did find on the list is considered one of the most concerning invasive species for Alaska, and I wish I had it in front of me. I'm completely spacing it, but very aggressive, and I believe it was Canada thistle, but I could be wrong on that. I'd have to double check my notes, but that is considered one of the top offenders for Alaska invasive species, and the fact that it's already there I think is pretty interesting. And it does have a tendency to, or the possibility to proliferate, and yeah, so this area has already been impacted. Even if it's just trace, this pristine area has been impacted by human activity.
Doesn't look like we have any more questions.
I'll have
Oh, sorry, there's Tim.
Tim Troll with the Bristol Bay Heritage Land Trust. Sort of following up on the issue of dispersed pollution, one of the issues that we're worried about is fugitive dust. And I'm wondering whether your studies will be looking at areas potentially off-site of the area that you've looked at in terms of where and the impact of dust from operations might be on vegetation and wetland outside of the core area that you've been studying, or whether that's an issue that's being addressed at all.
Fugitive dust is addressed in the air quality section, where they'll do the modeling for fugitive dust, also in the air permitting.
I'm trying not to jump in too early this time. So I think we're going to take an early lunch break. When are we coming back? It was 11:35.
Let's come back in an hour.
Okay.
Yeah, I think an hour is probably fine.
They bring them up as they get them. So yeah, we'll take a break for an hour and come back at 12:35.